Even from a young age, I knew both my cousins were liars. They always came up with these ridiculous stories to make their lives sound more interesting. It was harmless stuff, like how their absentee father was actually rich and buying them Disney World, or how they had long-distance boyfriends who were totally real and super mature and had mustaches and everything. Or even how they'd spotted a celebrity at the supermarket and were now best friends. Their proof was unconvincing. Trinkets they'd allegedly received as gifts, handwritten letters, and even magazine cutouts they tried to pass off as photos they'd taken. That's why when they moved to the next town over and claimed their new basement was haunted, I took it with a grain of salt. As it turns out, I should have used that metaphorical salt and poured it around myself in a protective circle, because a few weeks after they'd settled in, my sister and I were invited for a sleepover, and I got to see their basement for myself. I was expecting to find proof that my cousins were lying again, but as you can deduct from the fact that I'm posting about it on No Sleep, my investigation didn't go quite as planned. The night it happened, I was about 10 years old, not the youngest girl in our quartet. That honor went to my cousin Natalia, who was 3 months my junior, but young enough that my account of what happened was called into question by my aunt and uncle, who insisted I'd let my imagination get the better of me. While I never spoke of it again to my family, I maintain still to this day, over 20 years later, that it was all real. But enough setting up. Here's my story. You can judge for yourself. My sister, cousins, and I spent the day chatting in their room while our parents mingled. Our conversations were periodically interrupted by the whistle of a train in the distance, followed immediately by the ground trembling ever so slightly as it passed in proximity to the house. Once in a while, one of my cousins would mention a haunted basement, but rather than quench my curiosity, they insisted we wait until nightfall before going down to see it for the first time. I can still remember the torturous family supper, which dragged on and on, even as I watched the sunlight fade from the kitchen window. Then there were dishes, and after that, the long goodbyes as my parents left us for the night, with assurances that they'd be back in the morning to pick us up. Yeah. Night, Mom. Night, Dad. Love you too. Please leave. I have a haunted basement to explore. Finally, it was time. My sister grabbed the Ouija board we'd brought, and we headed downstairs with a stern warning from my aunt not to enter the third basement, whatever that meant. Allow me to set the scene, because the layout of their basement was pretty odd, and I'd never seen anything like it since. Their stairs led down into a large room, which felt much smaller from all the junk piled into it. It was packed floor to ceiling, with only a small carpeted area with a couch in the middle for us to sit on. There was a door that opened to a second room, and since there was one step down to this second room, we called it a second basement. Clever, I know. This one was emptier, with nothing but the washer and dryer on the far end. The room was maybe half the size of the first basement, but there was much more space to move around in. Then, there was the door to the third basement. It was really more of a window carved straight into the drywall on the side of the stairs. In hindsight, I realized this must have been some sort of storage space under the stairs rather than an actual room. But since there was no light, and it was packed full of miscellaneous items, and since my aunt herself had referred to it as the third basement, I assumed it was more than that. We spent the majority of the evening in the first basement, which looked like it had come straight out of your quintessential horror movie. I'm talking dust, a random rocking chair, creepy dolls, you name it, and it had it. I believe the home belonged to an old woman who passed away, and my aunt and uncle got it for dirt cheap at an estate sale. All the old junk included. They hadn't sorted through all of it yet, so there was a lot of boxes and the like. There was an atmosphere of creepiness lingering in the air. I can't really describe it, but it was like this electric sensation. You know when someone's standing behind you? It's like you know they're there, even if they're dead quiet. The first basement gave off that feeling faintly. The second basement was a bit worse, and the closer I'd get to the third, the worse it got. Like I was touching the surface of an old CRT monitor. As we were sitting in the first of the 3 basements, my cousin spotted a letter on the rocking chair. Even as a kid, I caught on to the conspiratorial looks between my older and younger cousins as they handed the letter to my sister and I. The paper was old parchment, or made to look like it. Had this perfume scent to it, and was written in, and I can't stress this enough, legible, black, cursive. I could tell it was made to look old, but I wasn't fooled. It was dated about 300 years prior, which if I knew my history right, predated the first settlement in the region. It was a love letter from some chick to her soldier husband. I only remember the gist of it, but basically, he'd gone off to war and she'd found out he'd been killed. Don't ask me why she was writing to him if she thought he was dead. So she was going to throw herself on the train tracks that night over her grief. One of my cousins explained that the 3rd basement connected to a tunnel that connected to the train station near their house, and that the letter's writer had slipped out of her room in the middle of the night and had died. Strange that she should know all this, since we'd only just discovered the letter. Again, I didn't really believe any of this, but the story lingered at the back of my mind as we started playing Ouija. A few physical illusion games, and finally, Truth or Dare. It was all innocent at first. Who liked which member of the Backstreet Boys, get locked in the second room for 2 minutes in the dark, do a headstand, etc. Finally, the choice came to me again. And not wanting to admit my crush on Nick Carter despite wearing a hoodie with his face on it, I picked Dare. My older cousin dared me to go into the 3rd basement. I only had to stay there for a moment, just long enough to say I'd done it, but my whole body had to pass the threshold. Oh boy, I wasn't ready for that one. I pleaded with my cousin to give me a different dare, because we'd been explicitly told not to go into the 3rd basement. Truth was, I didn't care about the rules. I was just scared to go in. The rule was just an excuse not to. Unfortunately, the 3 girls ganged up on me, making chicken noises and flapping invisible wings. My only choices were to go through with the dare or live my life in shame. Having no other option, I relented and slowly entered the 2nd basement. I dragged my feet all the way to that strange above-ground door window, silently hoping either my cousin would change her dare or my aunt would come down and save me. Neither of those things happened. My guts were nodding. I could feel the air getting denser and denser. My cousins and sister were standing by the doorway between the 1st and 2nd basements, watching me as I tentatively reached for the frame of the door window. I heard a few hushed, "Do it," and "Go on," but the encouragement didn't help ease my fear. I stood there for at least a minute, trying to garner the courage to hoist myself into what I assumed was some sort of small crawlspace-like room. I closed my eyes. I inhaled deeply, and then I kicked off the ground. I pulled my upper body into the 3rd basement, in the limited space available to me. It was tight, and it was dark, and even with my legs still hanging over the edge, I felt trapped. "You have to go all the way in," shouted my older cousin. I swallowed hard and shimmied myself forward, and then, just as I was trying to turn back around to see if I'd made it all the way through, I heard a click, and was plunged into absolute darkness. They turned off the light to the 2nd basement, and I could hear them giggle as they shut the door between the 1st and 2nd rooms. In a panic, I turned around and swiped into the dark to try and find the edge of the door window, so I climbed back out. But for some reason, all I could feel were walls, objects, and boxes. It made no sense. This was a small area packed with things. It shouldn't have been hard to find the only doorway because there hadn't been any space for me to go. There had only been enough room for a child to crawl into and turn around in, nothing more. It was boxes on the left, boxes on the right, and a wall straight ahead. And yet, there I was, scuttling along like a soldier crawling through the trenches, actually traveling some distance in a room that didn't have the space to crawl. And then I worried there was any truth to my cousin's story about the house being connected to the train station. What if I wasn't even in the house anymore? What if I was in the tunnels? The laughter grew more and more distant until it faded completely. I crawled and crawled, but I still couldn't find the door. What if I fell on the train tracks and got sliced in half? I reached a junction, which at first I mistook for the door window. Relieved, I reached my hand down expecting to meet thin air, but instead, I hit cold, solid concrete. I desperately pawed around, trying to get the lay of the land. There was a solid wall in front of me and corridors on either side. Wherever they led, I reasoned it wasn't back to the door window. I knew I hadn't passed the junction earlier, so I tried squeezing myself back the way I came. A solid frickin' wall. I swear to you on everything I love, the path I'd just come from was gone. I held back tears and I realized this, still somehow afraid that if I cried, my cousins would turn on the lights, jump out at me, and I'd be the laughing stock of the family. I turned left, having read something somewhere about how it was easier to get out of mazes if you picked a single direction and always followed it. What followed was the single most horrific moment in my entire life. As I finished a turn into the tight left passageway, still crawling completely alone in the dark, I felt something reach out and grab my leg. At this point, I started screaming and crying for help. Laughing stock be damned, it wasn't like my pant leg had gotten stuck in something. I remember feeling like there were multiple fingers squeezing my ankle and pulling me into somehow blacker darkness of the right tunnel. I began to hear a train approaching. The horn blared, and the sound was so loud, I could have sworn it was right on me. The room began to tremble, and I know it wasn't just me shaking like a leaf because I could feel dust or sand or something falling onto me from the ceiling. The hand tugged hard, and I was convinced the ghost of the heartbroken woman who had thrown herself on the train tracks over 300 years ago had somehow gotten hold of me and was dragging me over to the tracks to hell. I don't know. Have company in the afterlife? Maybe revenge? Who knows? The train was getting closer and closer, and the pull was getting stronger and stronger, dragging me away as I tried to hold on to anything for dear life. The grip remained firm. Even as I kicked and screamed, my heart was racing, my body was shaking from the outside in and the inside out, and sweat dampened my clothes. I was convinced I was about to die. And then I saw a light at the end of the tunnel. Or should I say, a light coming from the second basement. All of a sudden, the shaking stopped, and the grip around my ankle loosened. I felt another grip, this time around my arm. It was my aunt, and she'd latched onto me. She dragged me out of the third basement, looking damn upset. As she pulled, I felt unseen fingers cresting over the heels of my feet and tickling me as they tried weakly to hold onto the arch of my foot before they released me fully. As soon as I was back on the solid ground, I turned around and looked at the third basement, but all I could see were boxes on the left, boxes on the right, and a blank concrete wall in the far back.